Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on the quantitative results chapter. And just before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to present this information in case you are interested in additional support outside of this webinar. So we do provide assistance with all aspects of the dissertations. So if you are interested in more one-on-one support, then you can use the information presented here to contact us and learn more about the types of services that we provide. And just to give an overview of what we will be discussing today, so this presentation is on the quantitative results chapter. So we will be covering only the quantitative results chapter today. We will not be covering components of qualitative or mixed methods results chapters. We do have other webinars that are more geared towards qualitative research. So if you are interested in that, I would direct you to those webinars. And we'll first start off by talking about the purpose and importance of the results chapter to the dissertation. And then we'll talk about the components of the results chapter, including the introduction, data collection, descriptive statistics, assumptions testing, and answering of the research questions. Then at the end of the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you do have a question, you can type your question into the question section. And at the end of the presentation, any questions that aren't answered during the course of the presentation, I'll do my best to answer your questions at the end. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the results chapter and why it's important to your dissertation. So the purpose of the results chapter is to present the data and analyses conducted to answer your research questions and hypotheses. So the previous chapters of the dissertation, namely the introduction, literature review, and methodology chapters, set up the why and how of your research. So it sets up why your research is important, why you're conducting the research, and how you're going to conduct the research. By the time you get to the results chapter, you will have conducted your study already, you will have collected your data and run your analysis to answer your research questions. And the purpose of the results chapter is to present those findings. So it's to present what you found in your research. So in this chapter, you are answering your research questions that you set out in your previous chapters. And so in this chapter, by the end of the chapter, you will have presented the findings for each research question or hypothesis with a clear statement that answers each. So if your study has 5 research questions, by the end of your results chapter, you should have an answer to each of those 5 research questions. But you want to save further interpretation for the discussion chapter. So you don't want to go into implications or tying in the results to literature in the results chapter, because you save that type of discussion for the next chapter. And it's worth noting that although we're going to be covering the sections of the results chapter that are most typical based on our experience with many different schools, you do want to make sure that you follow your specific school's guidelines or requirements for the results chapter. So every school will be different. Some schools may require more sections than we present today. Some schools may require the sections to be ordered differently, or they might contain slightly different information. So you want to follow the specific guidelines of your school and defer to your school's guidelines if your school presents you with guidelines for the chapter. So now let's start talking about the different components of the results chapter. And like most chapters of the dissertation, you can start the results chapter with a short introduction section. And in this section, you typically restate the purpose of the study, restate your research questions and hypotheses, and then just provide an outline of what the chapter will contain. So when you restate the purpose of the study, this can be either a verbatim restatement of your purpose statement as you present it in previous chapters, or it can be an abbreviated version of your purpose statement. When you restate your research questions and hypotheses, these need to be stated exactly as they are presented in the previous chapters of the dissertation. So anytime your research questions and hypotheses appear in your document, they should be written the exact same way, using the exact same wording every time. And then for outlining the contents of the chapter, you can just simply list out the section headings that will appear in the results chapter. The next section would usually be the data collection and preparation section. So in this section, you want to summarize the data collection procedures that you followed and note any changes from your originally proposed data collection procedures. So this is important if anything changed between when you wrote up your proposal in your methodology chapter to when you actually collected your data, because sometimes things can change in between. So you may run into issues as you're doing your data collection. So you may have to change things about your procedures. So maybe you ended up having to sample from a different population than you originally intended, or use a different sampling method, or maybe some measures or variables that you originally intended to measure you weren't able to measure, or if you're using archival data, maybe some variables or measures weren't available to you that you originally thought there were going to be. So there could be any number of reasons why some things might change in between what you originally proposed and what you actually ended up doing. But these changes should be noted in your dissertation. So there are a number of different ways that you could go about doing this, and different schools will have different preferred methods. So sometimes schools will want you to just discuss the changes in the results chapter, whereas other times schools may want you to actually go back and revise your methodology chapter to reflect what you actually did. So this is another case where you want to make sure you follow your school's specific instructions for how to handle changes in your procedures. And in this section, in addition to discussing any changes, you'll want to talk about the results of your data collection. So, how many participants did you end up getting for your study? So what was your response rate? And you want to also discuss any attrition in your sample. So you'll want to discuss things like the total number of responses you received. So if you're doing something like a simple survey study, how many people answered your survey? And then you'll want to talk about if you have to remove any participants from your study and the reasons for removing them. So do you have to remove or exclude any responses? How many do you have to remove, and why do you have to remove them? So there could be a number of reasons why you might have to remove participants from your sample. So you might have specific inclusion and exclusion criteria for your study that participants need to meet in order to be included. And if you identify any respondents who did not meet those criteria, then you would have to exclude them. So for instance, you may need to talk about what your inclusion and exclusion criteria were, and if any participants did not meet those criteria, and if so, how many did you have to exclude? And you may also have to exclude participants for things like missing data. So especially if you're doing something like a survey study or an online survey, it's very likely that you'll get respondents who either skip questions or they stop taking the survey in the middle of the survey. So it's very likely that you'll get incomplete responses and you'll have to deal with missing data in some way. And so you'll need to talk about any participants that you might have to exclude because they didn't complete the survey or they had too many missing responses. And then once you talk about all of the exclusions, then you want to state your final total sample size. And if necessary, you may need to discuss a post hoc power analysis if you didn't meet the sample size requirement that you set out in your proposal. So usually in your proposal, in your methodology chapter, you would do a power analysis for a quantitative study to determine the number of participants or the sample size that you need for your study. And if you don't meet that sample size, then your school, your committee may require you to do a post hoc power analysis to determine the statistical power of your study with the sample that you obtained. And also in this section, you want to discuss any preliminary data preparation steps before you do your analyses. So this can involve a number of things, such as checking data for accuracy. So this is especially important if you're doing something like an in-person survey where people, use pen and paper to fill out surveys, and then you have to enter those survey responses into an electronic format yourself. You want to check the data entry to make sure that all of the responses are entered accurately. You'll most likely have to have some sort of plan for handling missing data because, as I mentioned before, it's very likely that you'll have missing or incomplete responses. So how are you going to handle participants who are missing data? Are you just going to completely exclude participants who have any missing data, or are you going to try to include participants who have missing data? And if so, how are you going to handle the missing values? Are you going to try to replace them some way, like with a mean replacement, or do some kind of imputation to replace the values? You'll want to have some sort of plan for that, and you'll want to discuss exactly how you handle those missing responses in your results chapter. And you may also do things like check for outliers or do any recoding of the data if you need to score certain instruments. So if you're doing a survey study and you're using, instruments that have, a number of questions on them, like you're using a survey instrument to measure certain constructs or variables, those instruments may need to be scored a certain way. So in this section, you can also discuss the scoring of the instruments or any coding of the data that you need to do to prepare it for the analysis. So let's take a look at just a couple of examples of what you might write in this data collection and preparation section. So here we have an example where we first state the total number of survey responses that were received. And then we talk about how we need to exclude some participants. So for instance, participants who are missing more than 50% of the questions. Then we state our final total sample size and also have a statement talking about how we're handling any remaining missing values or responses. Here's another example of an excerpt from the section that has a little bit more information. We have more information about when the data collection took place. Again, we state the total number of participants that responded, and then we go into detail about participants that were excluded for various reasons. So whether they didn't agree to the informed consent or they had a certain amount of responses missing, or they didn't meet the inclusion criteria for our study. And then at the end, we again state our final total sample size that we used for the analysis. And here's an example of how you might write up a post hoc power analysis. So, if you didn't meet your target sample size or you didn't get statistically significant results, you may be required to do a post hoc power analysis. So here, we state that we're doing a post hoc power analysis. We're stating the statistical tests that we're doing the post hoc power analysis for. So in this case, we're doing it for a t-test and a regression. And for each test that you're doing the post hoc power analysis for, you want to state what your sample size was. So our group sizes for our t-test and our sample size for our multiple linear regression, and state the level of power that was obtained for each test. So after you've discussed the information about your data collection and data preparation procedures, you can start getting into your descriptive statistics. So in this section, you want to provide descriptives both for the demographic variables in your study and all of the variables of interest. So in this case, the variables of interest would be any of the variables that are included in your research questions and hypotheses. So the actual variables that you are testing. And so you'll want to provide things like frequencies and percentages for any categorical variables. So this can include things like gender or ethnicity, and provide things like means and standard deviations for continuous variables. So this might be something like someone's age in years or GPA. If possible, you'll want to compare the demographic characteristics of your sample to the population so that the reader can have an idea of how representative your sample is. So if you do have population statistics, for instance, for things like breakdowns of gender or ethnicity in the population, you want to compare the breakdowns of gender and ethnicity in your sample to those numbers to give the reader an idea of how close your sample was to those numbers. So did you get roughly the same proportion of men and women in your sample as there are in the population, or was it different? And another thing you may want to present in the descriptives is reliability coefficients. So this would usually be done with Cronbach's alpha for any measures where reliability is applicable. So this would mainly be things like survey instruments that have multiple items. So for instance, if you're using some survey instrument to measure something like self-esteem and it has 10 questions, you may need to run Cronbach's alpha on those 10 questions to make sure that the instrument is reliable in your sample. And so here are some excerpts to show how you might present the descriptive statistics. So in this example, we're showing a breakdown of our categorical variables. So you might present a table that shows the frequencies and the percentages for any categorical or nominal variables, as well as some narrative to describe what's in the table. One thing that's important to note as you present your results is the organization of tables in relation to the narrative text. So first, you want to make sure that any table that you put in your document is referred to in the text. So you can see here, we say our demographic characteristics are displayed in table 1. You never want to just have a table in the document that isn't referenced to or explained in the narrative. Another thing you want to keep in mind is the proximity of the table to the narrative in which it is referenced. So you want to make sure that those are close to each other. Usually the table should appear immediately following the text where it is referenced. So for instance, you don't want to have narrative that refers to table 1 and then table 1 doesn't appear until 5 pages later. Similarly, you don't want to present table 1 and then start talking about what's in table 1 or referencing table 1 until 5 pages after that. You want them to be close together. And here's an example of how you might present a table containing descriptive statistics for continuous variables. So in this table, we have minimum and maximum values as well as mean and standard deviation. And then here's how you might present a table for Cronbach's alpha reliability coefficients. So you may want to present the number of items and the Cronbach's alpha coefficient for each of the instruments used in your study. After you go through all of your descriptives, it's time to start getting into discussion of the main analyses that you're doing to answer your research questions. But before you can do that, you need to talk about the assumptions of those analyses. So essentially, all inferential statistics that you do that would be used to answer your research questions have some sort of statistical assumptions associated with those tests. So for instance, if you're doing something like a t-test, some assumptions include testing for normality and homogeneity of variance. And different statistical tests will have different assumptions required for those tests. So before you present the results of your tests, you need to talk about the testing of the assumptions for each of the tests. So you may want to have a section before you get into your results that talks specifically about assumptions testing. And different schools will have different requirements or suggestions for how to organize this. Sometimes they want you to present the assumptions just all in their own section, or it may also be acceptable to just present the assumptions for each test as you present the tests. But for each test that you're doing, you will want to list and discuss the required assumptions tests for that particular analysis. And so you want to list all of the assumptions required. So for instance, if you're doing a t-test or an ANOVA, you may need to do assumptions testing for normality and homogeneity of variance. You'll want to state how each assumption is tested. So for instance, if you need to test normality, how are you going to test normality? So are you going to do it by looking at histograms? Are you going to do it by conducting a Shapiro-Wilk test? Are you going to do it by looking at skewness and kurtosis values, or using some other method? So you want to state exactly how the assumption is tested. You'll want to state what the result of the assumptions test is. So, if you're testing normality with a Shapiro-Wilk test, what is the result of that test? You'll want a clear statement about whether or not the assumption is met. So if you're testing normality, again, you state, the assumption normality was met, or the assumption normality was not met. And then you want to describe any action taken if the assumption isn't met. So if you find that the assumption of normality is violated, what are you going to do about that? So are you going to try to transform the data or the variables to make the data normal? Are you going to try to remove any outliers that are causing the data to be non-normal? Or are you going to perhaps run an alternative test? Like if you were going to do a t-test, instead you're going to do a non-parametric test. Instead, that doesn't require the normality assumption to be met. So if you do have any violations of assumptions, you want to talk about how you are responding to those violations. And again, depending on how your school wants you to organize this information, the assumptions can be presented in their own section, or they can be presented alongside each analysis. So let's take a look at some examples of how we might present the results of assumptions testing. So here we're testing normality, and we're doing it by presenting a normal probability plot. And we state here that normality was tested by inspection of this normal PP plot. We present the plot in a figure here. We state that the data showed no significant deviation from the normal line, so we interpret what is in the plot. So we are stating the result of the test. And then we give an indication of whether the assumption was met or not. In this case, the assumption is met because the data appear to follow the normal line. Now, here's some more examples of how you might write up assumptions testing. And in this case, we have an example where one of our assumptions is violated. So we can see here, we do a test for outliers. We say how we're testing for outliers. We're doing it by looking at standardized values. And here we state that we do observe an outlier in our data. And we say that we're going to exclude this outlier from our analysis. So we state how we are dealing with the violation of that assumption. Then once you have discussed all of your assumptions, it's finally time to present the results of your analyses that answer your research questions and hypothesis. So you'll want to organize this section by research question if possible. So if you have 5 research questions, you'll just want to go in order of research question 1 through 5. You don't want to kind of jump around and start with research question 2 and then go to research question 4 and then back to research question 1. You'll want to follow your research questions in order. And similar to your data collection procedures, if there are any changes from your originally proposed data analysis procedures, you will want to discuss those in this section. So especially if you did have any changes to your data collection procedures, it's possible that those changes may have also impacted the types of data analyses that you're able to do. So if that changed from your proposal, you will want to explain and justify the new data analysis procedures that you ended up following in your results chapter. For each analysis, you want to clearly identify the variables that are used in the analysis. So if you're doing something like a t-test or an ANOVA, you want to clearly identify your independent and dependent variables. If you're doing a correlational analysis like a regression, you want to identify your predictor variables, your criterion variable, and any covariates you include in your analysis. You'll want to provide appropriate statistics associated with each test. So most tests will have p-values. You may also want to report effect sizes associated with the tests, as well as confidence intervals, as well as test statistics corresponding to the tests. So if you're doing a t-test, you may want to present the t statistic and degrees of freedom. If you're doing an ANOVA, report the f statistic and the degrees of freedom, and so on. If your analysis requires any post-hoc testing, then you'll want to present the results of those post-hoc tests. So one example would be if you're doing an ANOVA and your ANOVA turns out to be significant, you may need to do post-hoc tests to determine the exact nature of the differences that you found in the ANOVA. So you'd want to report that post-hoc testing. And importantly, this section should include clear statements that answer each research question and hypothesis based on the results of the analysis. So after you present the statistics for each analysis, you want to interpret those statistics and make a statement that answers your research question or addresses the hypothesis. So usually in a quantitative study, you may have your hypotheses written in the null and alternative format. And if this is the case, then it is usually sufficient to make a statement about the null hypothesis. So you can say your null hypothesis was rejected if you found statistically significant results, or your null hypothesis was not rejected if your results were not significant. So now let's look at some examples of how we might write up the results of a couple commonly used tests. So this example features a t-test. So we start by saying what analysis we're doing. We're doing an independent samples t-test. We state our independent and dependent variables. And then we show the results of the t-test, including our t-statistic with our degrees of freedom here in parentheses, our p-value, which in this case is greater than 0.05, so it's not significant, and our measure of effect size here, which for the t-test is Cohen's d. And then we make an interpretation of the statistics. So again, this is based on our p-value being greater than 0.05, so it's not significant. We state that the test is not significant. We make an interpretation. So non-significant tests means that there are no differences between the groups. And we make a statement that answers our hypothesis. We say the null hypothesis was not rejected. And then you may display any other statistics relevant to the analysis. So for something like a t-test where you're comparing groups, you might display the means and the standard deviations of the groups that you're comparing. Now, here's another example of a t-test, but this time our t-test is significant. Again, we state that we're doing a t-test. We state our independent and dependent variables. We state that our test is significant. Again, this time our p-value is less than 0.05 here. So it is significant. So there are differences between the groups. And we have a statement about our hypothesis. Because the result was significant, we reject our null hypothesis. Here's an example of how we might write up an analysis of variance or an ANOVA. So again, we state what test we're doing. We state our independent and dependent variables. We present the results of the ANOVA, so the statistics associated with the ANOVA. In this case, we present our F statistic, as well as our degrees of freedom in parentheses. For F tests, you'll always have two values for degrees of freedom instead of just one. The first value being the numerator degrees of freedom, the second value being the denominator degrees of freedom. We also have our p-value for our test. In this case, it's greater than 0.05. So this test is not significant. And so we state that our null hypothesis was not rejected. And again, for this type of analysis, you might display some descriptive statistics, so the mean standard deviations for the groups that you're comparing. Here's an example of how we might present the results of a correlational analysis. Here, we actually restate our research question first. Then we state we're conducting a Pearson correlation. And we state the variables that we're using in our analysis. And then we present our Pearson correlation coefficients. So we have our Pearson R, as well as the p-value associated with each correlation. And we see we have our p-values here that are less than 0.05. So we have significant correlations. And so we can reject our null hypothesis. We state that our null hypothesis is rejected. And for a correlation analysis, you might have a table showing all the correlations. If you're doing a correlation matrix, you might present these in a matrix. And here's some results for a regression analysis. So if you're doing a regression, you usually start by stating the results or significance of your overall regression model, which would be an F test. So again, we state our F statistic in degrees of freedom, our p-value, and for our regression, we may also state the R squared, which is the percent of variance explained. If our regression is significant, our p-value is less than 0.05, our null hypothesis is rejected. And then usually for a regression analysis, we would present a table showing the individual predictors for the regression. So that you might present them in a table like this, where you show all of your predictors in the regression here, and showing the results for each regression coefficient. And you might interpret the regression coefficients that are significant in your model. In this case, looks like the one variable in the regression here that is significant is sex. And so we have some narrative in here to describe that significant regression coefficient. Then after you present all of your results to answer each of your research questions, you may want to end your results chapter with a summary. So you can either summarize the entire contents of the results chapter or just summarize the answers to the research questions. In this section, you want to make sure you restate the answer to each research question or hypothesis. So reiterate whether each null hypothesis was rejected or not rejected. And then just provide a transitioning statement to your next chapter to say that you'll be discussing the meaning and implications of these findings. So that brings us to the end of the presentation on the quantitative results chapter. Again, if you are interested in additional support outside of this webinar, you can use the information here to contact us to learn more about the different forms of assistance that we can provide. And now I'll open things up to questions. So if you do have a question, you can enter that question into the question section now, and I will do my best to answer your questions. So question is it possible to get a copy of the PowerPoint? Yes. We do make the PowerPoint slides available as well as the recordings of the presentations available as well. So you can see the information provided there on how you can access that. And I'll just give another minute or so to give anyone else a chance to enter any questions. So the question is, how do you calculate sample size when the population size is unknown? So to do a sample size calculation, you would usually do a power analysis. So you would use a program such as GPower to enter in parameters about this specific analysis that you plan on doing. And such a program can tell you the appropriate sample size depending on the parameters that you enter. We do have other webinars that focus specifically on sample size calculation and power analysis. So if you do have more questions or want to know more about sample size estimation specifically, I'd direct you to those specific webinars. If anyone else has any more questions, feel free to type your questions in now. So the question is it mandatory to follow probability sampling for quantitative studies? It really depends on your specific school's or committee's requirements. But for this type of research, so for dissertation level research, it's very often the case that it will not be feasible to do probability sampling. It may just be the case that depending on what exactly your population is, it won't be reasonable or feasible for you to do a true random sample or a true probability sample from that population. You may have to rely on some kind of non-probability method, such as convenience sampling, just to be able to get your research done. So it's pretty common for dissertation level research to feature non-probability sampling, but again, you will want to defer to the specific requirements of your school, your degree program. It may be the case that they have some requirements on the type of sampling that they want you to do for a quantitative study, but as I said, it's pretty common for dissertation level research to feature things like convenience sampling. I'll just give it another minute or so if anyone else has any additional questions. And do journals insist on such requirements? Usually, if you're doing research to submit to a journal, they may have more rigorous requirements, but you may need to look at the specific requirements of the journal. And it's, there is research out there that gets published that is not based completely on probability sampling or true random sampling. Research does get published that uses things like convenience sampling, but it really depends on the type of journal that you are submitting to, and if the journal has any requirements for the type of research that they accept. So the question is it in bad form to change or add testing methods to a dissertation if not based on reaching sample size? So if you decide to conduct a regression analysis in addition to the ANOVA. So if you're deciding to change your test based on not meeting the sample size for the test that you originally proposed, then as long as you can provide justification that the alternative test that you're conducting is appropriate to use with the smaller sample size, then that should be fine. Really, any changes to your originally proposed data analysis plan, you just want to make sure that you provide justification for why you are making those changes. But in general, you don't want to go off doing a lot of extra analyses if they aren't needed to answer the research questions. Usually in the results chapter, other than doing some basic descriptive statistics to characterize your sample, you really just want to stick to the analyses that serve to answer your research questions. So if there's some kind of analysis you want to do, but it doesn't add to answering a specific research question or hypothesis, then chances are you don't really need to include it. All right, just give one more minute or so in case anyone else has any additional questions. Okay, it doesn't look like any more questions are coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and end our webinar there for today. I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. Again, if you are interested in additional support outside of the webinars, you can contact us and learn more about how we can help you. We also have webinars on other topics, so you're welcome to look at what other webinars we offer and see what other topics that we cover. Again, thanks everyone for attending today. I hope you all found this useful, and I hope everyone has a great day.